So I wanted to make a quick video about the new 14 and 16-inch M2 MacBook Pros and the Mac Mini, and talk about why I think the Mini specifically is going to completely change the global personal computing market. No, seriously, I actually think it will. And I'm not just going to blabber on about tech specs and speculate on performance either. I want to provide a different perspective here that you probably haven't heard before. So first, let's quickly get the MacBook Pros out of the way. Are they more powerful than their predecessors? Yes. Should you upgrade if you already have the previous version? No, definitely not. Personally, I already think the 2021 Pros were powerful enough, and these new M2 chips just gives it a nice little boost, particularly to GPU-heavy workflows. The only people these new chips should appeal to are those who have been looking to pick up one of these MacBooks but haven't until now. One interesting thing I did notice, however, is that there's now a small weight difference between the Pro and Max version of the 14-inch MacBook, whereas with the previous M1 generation, they were the same weight. Now, if you remember, the 14-inch MacBook Pro would sometimes struggle with thermals if you selected the more powerful M1 Max chip instead of the standard M1 Pro. Apple has clearly beefed up the cooling system on the M2 Max variant of the new 14-inch Pro to account for this, by likely adding around 30 grams or 0.1 pounds of additional heatsink area or increased heatsink density, which is really good because that's one of the reasons why I went to the larger 16-inch form factor of the 2021 models. I could run the M1 Max chip cooler with no thermal throttling and minimal fan noise, even under load. So it looks like this will be less of an issue on the 14-inch M2 Max models going forward. But yeah, like I said, it's merely a minor generational improvement to an already really good and powerful device. So let's move on to the really juicy stuff, the M2 Mac Mini. So again, just like the MacBook Pros, we're only getting a relatively minor generational jump from the M1 SoC to the M2. It's the exact same chip we've already seen in the M2 MacBook Pro last year, so we know exactly how it's going to perform. A noticeable but minor jump in CPU performance from the M1, which only specific workflows will notice, like developers and coders, for example, compiling code. But again, the GPU is where most of the gains are at, and you definitely will notice these gains in anything GPU related. Not to mention, the Mac Mini chassis is extremely good at regulating thermals. The M1 Mini came nowhere near thermal throttling, was almost dead silent during intensive tasks. The M2 chip is very similar, which means you'll actually get better performance from the M2 Mac Mini compared to the M2 MacBook Pro, which can throttle very slightly and also costs $700 more. That's right, the M2 Mac Mini is less than half the price of an M2 MacBook Pro, but you get the same or slightly better performance. Although, to be fair, you also get a keyboard and screen with the MacBook, but I think most people likely already have some kind of screen at home, and a keyboard is relatively cheap. But this new pricing is where it starts to get really interesting. Traditionally, the price of the Mac Mini has been at $699, but over the last 2 years, we've seen massive supply chain issues, silicon shortages, and rampant inflation. As a result, I would not have been surprised if the price of the M2 Mac Mini increased by $100, or at least stayed the same. Instead, Apple decided to drop the price. And here's why this is such a massive deal, in my opinion. Firstly, and I've touched on this in previous videos, Apple is sitting on billions and billions of dollars of cold hard cash in various bank accounts around the world. The company is literally richer than most countries. They can easily afford to cut the pricing on pretty much any one of their products. The question is though, why? Well, I believe that firstly, Apple knows they have a big advantage at this price point compared to competitors. Seriously, I mean, just look at the competition. If we look at a product with a similar form factor, like an Intel NUC, for example, the price starts anywhere from $400 for the older, outdated models to around $650 for one with a 12th generation Intel CPU. And these NUCs are bare bones systems, meaning you have to then go out and purchase your own RAM, SSD, and also power cord in some situations. taking the true cost to over $700 minimum. CPU performance between these CPUs and the M2 chip are similar, although I'd give the edge to Intel here, especially with their new 13th gen CPUs. But don't forget the M2 GPU is quite a bit more powerful than the integrated graphics in those Intel chips. Also, I'm not forgetting AMD here. They have good CPUs too with similar performance and at a cheaper price point than Intel. Now, alternatively, assuming you have the willingness, time, and knowledge to build your own system, not everyone does, and that's perfectly fine, you could probably build a system for a similar price to the M2 Mac Mini. Like this entry-level system on PCPartPicker.com. You'll get 16 gigabytes of RAM, although it's DDR4 versus DDR5 on the Mac, a bigger SSD, and also a discrete GPU, which will give you better performance compared to an integrated one. But again, you have to source all of these parts from various retailers, which is difficult or more expensive depending on your country, assuming they're even in stock. Then you got to build it yourself, and the form factor is also 20 times bigger than the Mac Mini. And I think Apple is lowering the price of the M2 Mac Mini to compete with all of these things. Most people at this price point just want to buy something that works out of the box. They don't want to mess around with buying RAM or building a cheap PC. And why would you? If an M2 Mac Mini is cheaper and also gives you very similar performance. This is of course assuming you can actually use macOS and you're not restricted to Windows due to software or app compatibility. Also, a big pro to these Windows systems is you can swap some failed parts out or upgrade them in the future, which you can't do in the locked down Mac ecosystem. Moving on, the advantage of the M2 Mac Mini's performance at this price range is going to be extremely beneficial for those who don't have a lot of money to spend. And this is going to become even more pronounced if the rumors of an upcoming recession are true. And there's two examples I want to use here. Firstly, students. If you've just started a computer science course, for example, and want to compile code, or you want to get into 3D animation on After Effects, this is a very cost-effective solution, especially when you consider the additional performance that you'll get from something like the Neural Engine and the impact it'll have on coding, for example. Also, that student discount reduces the price even further to just $500. Or if you live in a country where the average salary is very low and you're trying to find work online, creating social media content or editing videos or photos or whatever, again, this is a very cost-effective and good solution. And just like the Neural Engine for coding has things built in that you can take advantage of, like the video encoders and decoders, making the performance better than what it should be. Take this video you're watching, for example. It was entirely edited on a base model 256 gigabyte SSD and 8 gigabyte RAM M1 chip. Yes, the M1, not even on the newer M2. This footage is being shot on a Sony a7S Mark III in 4K at the highest possible bitrate. And these B-roll clips you've been watching are shot on a professional camera. You know what? Just hang on one sec. So this is my Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K. I don't know why they call it a pocket camera because as you can see, let's see if I can get it into focus, it's absolutely massive. When you rig this bad boy out, it comes to about I think 5 or 6 kilos. And this is actually a professional camera, right? So you'll see this in professional environments like corporate videos or even some movies, for example. And I'll actually use this here in the studio to shoot most of the B-roll. And I'll shoot in either 6K B-RAW or sometimes 4K ProRes. So some pretty demanding footage. I'm just gonna put this down quickly before I continue on because it is really heavy. And sure, the editing experience for footage like this isn't perfect. You have to drop the timeline resolution down, and there's a bit of stuttering now and then. And ideally, you'd have at least 16 gigabytes of RAM or a more powerful Pro chip. But it works, and you can now offer your services online from anywhere on the planet to companies or individuals looking for freelancers and make a living from it. And to me, that's incredible. I think it really changes the game for those living in poorer countries, for example, where $600 may be all they can afford. Not to mention, you can now upgrade the Mini to an M2 Pro chip, the same price of an M2 MacBook Pro. And make no mistake here, like Apple isn't dropping the price of the M2 Mac Mini out of the goodness of their heart. This is 100% a corporate strategy to improve market share and profit in the long term, but the end result is a net positive for those at this price point. And I'm really curious to see how the market share between budget desktop Macs and PCs changes over the next few years if Apple keeps this up.